In the early autumn of 1888, the water along the Calumet shoreline pulled back from the rocks and simply refused to come home. This was not a tide. Lake Superior does not have tides worth mentioning. The lake fell 17 feet in a matter of days, and where there had only ever been cold black water, the fishermen of the Keweenaw Peninsula found themselves staring at something that had no business being there. Walls. Cut stone walls, squared and fitted, running in long straight lines out under the surface of the deepest lake in North America. Within a week, the United States Army had men standing on that shoreline. Within another week, the walls were gone again, buried under water that crept back as quietly as it had left. No newspaper ran the follow-up. No survey was ever published. The men who had stood on those rocks went back down into the copper mines, and most of them kept their mouths shut for the rest of their lives. But a few of them talked, and what those few described does not fit anything you have ever been taught about the history of this continent. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand what Calumet actually was in 1888, because the textbooks have quietly let you forget. This little town on a frozen finger of land sticking out into Lake Superior was, for a stretch of years, one of the richest places on planet Earth. Not rich the way a boomtown is rich, with mud streets and a saloon. Rich the way an empire is rich. The Calumet and Hecla Mining Company was pulling native copper out of the ground in quantities that genuinely do not make sense. Pure copper. Not ore you have to crush and smelt and refine. Copper you could cut with a saw, sitting in seams and in single masses so enormous that crews spent weeks chipping at one boulder of metal before they could haul it up. Think about that for a second. Everywhere else on the planet, copper comes locked inside rock, bound up with sulfur and other minerals, and it takes enormous industrial effort to free it. But under the Keweenaw, the copper was already pure, already separated, sitting there in the basalt as if someone, at some point, had already done the refining. Geologists have a tidy explanation involving ancient lava flows and hydrothermal fluids, and maybe that is all it is. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. But the men who actually went down into those tunnels found things the geology textbooks have never comfortably explained. They found ancient mining pits, thousands of them. Long before any European set foot on the peninsula, somebody had been pulling copper out of this exact ground and pulling out a staggering amount of it. The official story is that prehistoric native peoples did this with stone hammers over thousands of years. And they certainly mined some of it, but the sheer scale of what came out of the Keweenaw over the centuries has never added up. Estimates of the copper removed from those ancient pits run into the hundreds of millions of pounds, and almost none of it shows up in the archaeological record of the people who supposedly took it. So the obvious question, the one nobody in a museum wants to sit with for long, is simple. Where did all that copper go? Who was it for? And what kind of civilization needs that much pure conductive metal before electricity was even supposed to exist? Hold on to that question, because it is the thread that runs through everything that happened off Calumet in 1888. The year had been strange from the start. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was one of the harshest anyone on the peninsula could remember, and the spring that followed was bone dry. The streams that fed the lake ran low. Then came a long stretch of relentless offshore wind, the kind that on a body of water as vast as Superior can physically push the lake. Sailors had a word for it, a seiche. The water piles up on one side and drops on the other, like coffee sloshing in a cup that someone nudged. Normally a seiche lasts hours and the lake settles back. What happened off Calumet did not settle back. The water went out, and it stayed out, and the locals stood on the exposed lake bed in the cold morning fog, looking at a landscape that no living person had ever seen. The first reports came from fishermen who had gone out to check their nets and found the nets sitting on dry rock, As they walked further out onto the newly exposed shelf, they started noticing that the rock under their boots was not behaving like natural rock. It was too regular, too flat in places, with edges that turned at clean angles. One man, in an account that survived only because it was written into a private letter, described stepping up onto what he first took for a low natural ledge and realizing he was standing on top of a wall, a built wall. Coursed stone, each block fitted against the next, so precisely that he could not slip a knife blade between them, running away from him in a dead straight line until it disappeared back under the waterline. Within a day or two, half the town had walked out to see it. And the more people looked, the more there was to see. The single wall was part of something larger. There were corners. There were what looked like the foundations of structures, laid out in a pattern too organized to be anything but deliberate. And there was the carving. Several witnesses described markings cut into the stone, not crude scratches. Deep, confident lines, geometric in places, and in other places resembling figures or symbols that nobody recognized and nobody could read. The stone itself was wrong for the area. Superior's shoreline is basalt and sandstone and conglomerate. The blocks of these walls were described as a pale, fine-grained stone that did not match anything in the local geology, which meant that wherever it came from, somebody had moved it here. The carvings became the detail people fixated on, and for good reason. A wall could be argued away as a freak of natural fracturing, because basalt does sometimes break along startlingly clean planes. But fracturing does not produce symbols. One account, attributed to a mining captain who had spent years underground and was not a man given to flights of fancy, described running his hand along a vertical face and feeling a series of grooves cut in a repeating sequence, evenly spaced, each one the same depth, the way a machine repeats itself rather than the way water erodes. He described shapes that reminded him of nothing he had seen in any church or any book. Concentric rings. A row of upright marks like tally strokes but too regular. And in one place, set apart from the rest, something he could only call a sun, a central circle with lines radiating out from it, cut deep enough that he could lay 2 fingers inside the channel. He told it the way men tell things they wish they had not seen. What unsettled the more educated observers was not that the marks were strange, but that they were familiar in the wrong way. The radiating sun, the concentric circles, the precise coursed masonry of imported pale stone, these are the visual signature of megalithic construction found scattered across the entire planet, from the Andes to the Mediterranean to the standing stones of northern Europe. The same building vocabulary, the same obsession with fitting enormous stones together without mortar, the same solar symbolism, turning up under a lake in northern Michigan where, according to everything we are told, no such culture ever reached. Either 3 unrelated peoples on 3 continents independently invented the identical architecture and the identical symbols by pure chance, or the planet once shared a single building culture whose memory we have lost. The walls off Calumet did not just suggest a lost city. They suggested a lost world, and a world that had once been everywhere. Now, in any reasonable world, this is the moment a discovery like this becomes the story of the century. A drowned stone city surfacing out of the largest freshwater lake on Earth. Carved walls of imported stone in a place where the history books insist there was nothing but wilderness until the mining companies arrived. You would expect surveyors, scholars, photographers, the whole apparatus of Gilded Age science descending on Calumet to document every inch of it. That is not what happened. What happened instead is the part of this story that should make the hair on your arms stand up. The Army came first. Specifically, the Army Corps of Engineers, the same body that controlled navigation, harbours, and the great locks at Sault Ste. Marie that every ship on the upper lakes had to pass through. They arrived fast, faster than information travelled in 1888 should reasonably allow, which tells you that somebody with a telegraph line and authority decided very quickly that this was their business and nobody else's. The engineers cordoned off the exposed lakebed. Townspeople, who had been walking freely across the ruins for days, were suddenly turned back. The official explanation, to the extent there was one, was concern about the unstable shoreline and the danger of the water returning, a safety matter, nothing more. But the men who watched from the bluffs said the engineers were not behaving like people managing a hazard. They were behaving like people conducting a recovery. There were wagons. There was, by several accounts, a great deal of activity around the carved sections, specifically the walls with the markings on them. And then, just as the seiche had ended, the wind shifted, the water came back, and Lake Superior swallowed the whole thing again. Within a few weeks it was as if it had never surfaced at all. The cordon came down because there was nothing left to cordon. The lake had done the army's job for it. Here is where a normal mystery would simply fade out, the kind of thing that becomes a tall tale grandfathers tell. Except the records do something very peculiar. They go quiet in a way that records do not go quiet by accident. The Calumet of 1888 was not some isolated outpost. It had multiple newspapers. It had telegraph offices. It had a literate, prosperous population of engineers, managers, and mining men who wrote constantly, in company logs, in personal correspondence, in the meticulous documentation that a major industrial operation generates every single day. An event that drew half the town out onto the lake bed for a week should have left a paper trail you could see from space, and for the period right around that autumn, the local record has holes in it. Newspaper archives from those specific weeks are incomplete in libraries that are otherwise complete. Company correspondence from the period survives, except for the stretch that would have covered this. The pattern, when you go looking, is not the soft fading of a forgotten event. It is the clean removal of a documented one. So let us step back from the shoreline and ask the bigger question. Not what those fishermen saw. We will probably never prove that to a court's satisfaction. The bigger question is why anyone with the power to send the army would care so much about a few carved walls that they would seal a discovery and scrub the record within a month. And to answer that, you have to leave Calumet and look at the world those walls came from. Because Calumet is not the only place this happened. It is one node in a pattern that stretches across the entire continent, and once you see the pattern, the cover-up stops looking paranoid and starts looking inevitable. Across 19th century North America, settlers kept finding things in the ground that did not belong to the history they had been handed. Earthworks the size of cities. Mounds laid out with mathematical precision, aligned to the solstices, containing copper artifacts, and worked metal that the official timeline could not account for. Massive stone structures that got quietly attributed to the most recent occupants, and then, just as quietly, levelled to make room for farms and railroads. There is a whole catalogue of 19th century newspaper reports describing the discovery of unusually large skeletons, advanced metalwork, and structures of dressed stone in regions where the textbooks insist no stone-building civilization ever existed. Most of those reports were never followed up. The artifacts went to private collections or to institutions and then, in case after case, simply could not be located again. The people who study this pattern, and there are more of them every year, have a name for the worldview it points toward. They call it the Old World. Not old as in ancient and primitive, old as in advanced, global, and erased. The argument goes like this. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The history you were taught, the comfortable story of slow human progress from caves to candles to the light bulb, is a story that was assembled and enforced relatively recently, in the 1800s and 1900s, by the same institutions that benefited from people believing it. And underneath that story, buried in the ground and drowned under the lakes, and rebranded as natural geology, are the remains of a prior civilization that was wiped out and written over. And here is the part that connects directly back to the copper. That old world, the argument goes, did not run on the energy system we run on. It did not burn coal and oil to make electricity in massive central plants and then sell it back to the population by the meter. It ran on something else, something atmospheric. The Earth itself, in this view, carries a usable electrical potential, a current running through the ground and through the air, and a civilization that understood this would not build power plants. It would build conductors. It would build vast structures out of specific materials chosen for their relationship to that current, and it would place those structures in specific locations chosen for the same reason. Materials like quartz-bearing stone, materials like iron, and above all, materials like copper. Pure, native, conductive copper in quantities that no 19th century economy could possibly have a use for, sitting under the Keweenaw Peninsula in seams that looked like they were already refined, because, in this telling, they were. Now Calumet stops being a random discovery and starts being the center of the map, the richest deposit of pure copper on the continent. Ancient mining pits showing that someone extracted hundreds of millions of pounds of it before recorded history, and drowned stone walls of imported carved stone sitting in the lake right beside it. If you wanted to find the infrastructure of an old world energy economy, a place that was conductor and power source and node all at once, you would be hard-pressed to design a better candidate than the exact spot where the lake fell 17 feet in 1888. And if you were one of the men who controlled the new energy economy, the one being built right at that very moment on coal, oil, and metered electricity, the existence of that old world is the single most dangerous fact on Earth. Not because it is spiritual, because it is economic. Stop and look at the calendar. The late 1880s are the precise hinge of the modern power industry. This is the era of the War of the Currents, of the fight over how electricity would be generated, distributed, and above all, billed. Enormous fortunes were being assembled around the principle that energy is scarce, that it must be produced in central facilities owned by a few, and that everyone else must pay continuously for access to it. That entire economic structure, the one we still live inside today, depends on one assumption being unquestionable: the assumption that there is no free, ambient, planetary current that anyone could simply tap. The assumption that the old world energy economy never existed. A drowned city of conductive stone next to the largest copper deposit on the continent is not a curiosity to those men. It is a threat to the foundational premise of their entire economy. It is physical, photographable, on American soil evidence that energy might not be scarce at all, that it might once have been freely available, and that the scarcity everyone was being asked to pay for was manufactured. You do not let that sit on a public shoreline for a single extra day. You send the army, you seal it, you wait for the lake to do the rest, and you make the paperwork disappear. Not out of malice, out of arithmetic. It is worth lingering on just how much money came out of Calumet, because the scale of it is what gives the cover-up its motive. Calumet and Hecla did not merely turn a profit. For years it paid dividends that made its shareholders some of the wealthiest individuals in the United States, returning more to its investors than almost any enterprise of its era. The stock was held tightly by a small circle of Boston financiers, the same families whose names sat on banks, on railroads, and on the boards of the very institutions that were busy assembling the official history of the country. The copper of the Keweenaw did not enrich the men who dug it. They lived in company housing, bought from the company store on company credit, and died young of rock dust and cave-ins. The wealth flowed east, into the exact financial network that was, in those same decades, capitalizing the build-out of the new electrical economy. So picture the men at the top of that network. They owned the copper. They were funding the spread of metered power. And then word reaches them by telegraph that on their own copper-bearing shoreline, the lake has pulled back and revealed the dressed stone infrastructure of some prior civilization, sitting right on top of the richest conductive metal deposit on the continent. These are not superstitious men. They are the most coldly rational operators of their age. They do not need to understand the metaphysics of an old-world current to understand a balance sheet. Evidence that energy was once abundant and freely drawn is, to them, a liability of incalculable size. It is the one fact that could unwrite the scarcity their entire fortune was being built upon. The decision to seal it would not have been agonized over. It would have been obvious and fast and quiet, the way all their most important decisions were. This is why the niche we are sitting in is not really about lost ruins at all. It is about economic history, It is about the suspicion that the story of how we came to pay for energy, for land, for the basic conditions of life, was not the natural outcome of progress, but the deliberate product of erasing the alternative. The walls off Calumet, if they were ever there, were not just archaeology. They were a balance sheet from a different economy, and that economy had to be drowned before the new one could collect its first bill. Let us go back to the men who saw it, because their fates are part of the story too, and they follow a pattern that anyone who has studied these cases will recognize immediately. The fisherman who wrote the letter describing the wall did not become famous. He did not write a book. According to the account, he stopped talking about it within a year and grew agitated whenever it was raised. Several of the other named witnesses left the peninsula entirely, which in a company town in 1888 was not a casual decision. Leaving meant starting over with nothing. People did not do it on a whim. They did it when staying became impossible. And at least one of the men most associated with the discovery turns up in later records having died younger than you would expect, in circumstances vague enough to invite questions and documented poorly enough to never answer them. You can read those facts two ways. You can say these were hard men in a hard place where life was cheap and accidents were common, which is true. Or you can notice that the people who saw the thing the army wanted unseen had a striking tendency to fall silent, leave, or die, and you can ask whether that is a coincidence. The records, as usual, do not help you decide, because the records around all of it are exactly as thin as they would need to be if someone wanted them that way. Now, I want to be fair to the skeptic in you, because that skeptic is doing important work. There are entirely ordinary explanations available for almost every piece of this. Seiches are real, and Superior has produced dramatic ones. The human eye, standing on a fog-bound, exposed lakebed, will pattern-match natural rock formations into walls and faces and symbols, because that is what the human brain does. Native copper deposits genuinely are a known geological phenomenon, even if the Keweenaw is an extreme example. 19th-century newspapers printed sensational hoaxes constantly, and a drowned city story is exactly the kind of thing a slow news week would invent. Records go missing for boring reasons all the time. Fires, floods, neglect, mold, the simple entropy of paper. Every single thread of this can be pulled and explained away on its own. But here is what the skeptic has to reckon with. The explaining away only works thread by thread. The moment you lay all the threads down next to each other, the ordinary explanations start to require you to believe in a remarkable run of coincidences, all of them pointing in the same direction, all of them conveniently erasing the same thing. The richest pure copper on the continent, the ancient pits whose output cannot be accounted for, the drop, the imported carved stone in a place with no stone-building history, the army arriving faster than the news should travel, the cordon that behaved like a recovery, the lake returning at exactly the convenient moment, the clean holes in an otherwise complete record, the witnesses who scattered and silenced. You can dismiss any one of these. Dismissing all of them, together, in a way that just happens to leave the official economic history untouched, takes a kind of faith of its own. And the pattern does not stop at Calumet. That is the thing that finally tips it over for a lot of people. Go looking, and you find the same shape repeating across the country and across the century. A startling discovery of dressed stone, advanced metalwork, or anomalous earthworks. A brief flurry of local attention. The fast arrival of some authority, often military, often the Corps of Engineers, given how many of these sites sit on rivers, lakes, and harbours. A reason given that sounds reasonable, and then silence, removal, and a record that thins out right at the crucial point. The drowning of Calumet is not an isolated freak event. It is one performance of a procedure that seems to have been run, in one form or another, dozens of times, until the old world was safely underground and the new economy stood on top of it unchallenged. Consider how many of these vanished discoveries cluster around water and around the Corps of Engineers in particular. The Corps controlled the rivers, the harbours, the locks, the dredging, every place where the nation's water was managed. If you wanted an institution with a standing reason to be present at any waterside anomaly, with the manpower to coordinate, the authority to classify it, and the equipment to move or bury it. You could not invent a better one than the body that already held jurisdiction over every shoreline in the country. The recurring appearance of military engineers at these sites is treated, in the official telling, as coincidence, because of course the core is near water. But that is exactly the point. An institution that is always already near the water is an institution that is always already positioned to be the first one there when the water gives something up. Calumet sat on a lake the core managed for navigation. The men who arrived had every legitimate reason to be in the region and every capability required to make a discovery disappear. Legitimate access is the most powerful cover there is, because it never has to explain itself. So, what do we actually have left, more than a century later? We have a town that used to be one of the wealthiest places on the planet and is now a quiet place most people could not find on a map, which is its own kind of strange. The fortune that came out of the Keweenaw did not stay in the Keweenaw. It flowed outward, into the same eastern financial houses that were building the new power economy. And then the copper played out, or was declared played out, and the money left, and the town was allowed to go cold. The mines flooded, the shafts sealed. Whatever is down there, including those ancient pits whose missing copper nobody can explain, sits under black water now, as drowned as the walls. We have a lake that, every so often, still does the thing it did in 1888. Seizures still happen on Superior. The water still occasionally pulls back from the Keweenaw shoreline and exposes the shallows. And every so often, somebody walking out on that rock still reports seeing something. A line that is too straight, an angle that is too clean, a surface that looks worked. And every time, the explanation arrives quickly, the curiosity gets gently managed, and the water comes back. The lake has become the perfect collaborator. It hides the evidence for free, and it can be relied upon to hide it again. And we have the question we started with, the one the museums do not want to sit with, except now it has teeth. Where did all that copper go? Who was it for? What kind of civilization needs hundreds of millions of pounds of pure conductive metal pulled from one peninsula before electricity is even supposed to exist? The official answer is that we do not really know, and that the question is not very interesting. But the official answer comes from the same institutions that built their authority on the timeline the walls would have shattered. They are not a neutral party here. They are the heirs of the people who sent the army. You do not have to believe every piece of this. Anyone who tells you they have it all proven is selling you something, and certainty is the one thing this story refuses to provide. But you are allowed to notice things. You are allowed to notice that the deepest, coldest, least disturbed body of fresh water in the world sits right beside the richest pure copper on the continent. You are allowed to notice that for one strange autumn in 1888, the water pulled back and people said they saw a city, and that the response to a city surfacing was not wonder but containment. You are allowed to notice that the version of history which makes all of this go away is also, very conveniently, the version of history that lets the meter keep running. The walls, if they are down there, are not going anywhere. The lake will keep them. Maybe that is the real reason nobody ever went back with the technology to settle it. The sonar and the divers and the surveys that could end the argument in an afternoon. Maybe the question is more useful to certain people, while it stays unanswered, dismissible, a thing for fishermen and dreamers, than it would ever be if someone actually proved what the 17 feet of missing water revealed. Because the moment you can hold the answer in your hand, you have to ask the next question. And the next question is not about a drowned city in a cold lake. The next question is about every bill you have ever paid to keep the lights on, and whether the darkness was ever really the natural state of things, or just the price of admission to a world that was built on top of one that already had the lights figured out. Lake Superior fell 17 feet off Calumet in 1888, and something underneath looked back. The army made sure you never got to. And the only honest thing anyone can say now, standing on that cold shore with the water back where it belongs, is that the lake is keeping a secret, and it has had a very long time to learn how to keep it well.